Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The List Doctor. I am Tom, the lowest of men of 6++ Gaming, and I'm very excited today to talk to you about some common list archetypes. Here's the structure as we're going to be working with today. I'm going to look at Take All Comers, Gunline, Alpha Strike, Vehicle or Monster Skew, Multiple Small Units or MSU, Horde, and Pressure List archetypes. These aren't going to be perfect. They're not going to capture exactly the kinds of builds you see out there in the 40k world, but they will let you know some of the broad types and styles of list design that you see people using. What I'm going to do with each one is talk about what it's intended to do and how it's intended to play. Think a little bit about some of the common examples from the past few years of that kind of build in action, and reflect briefly on its strengths and weaknesses as well. I'll be going a bit more in depth on these different types in future, but today I just wanted to give you a sort of big overview before we go forwards. So let's start by thinking about Take All Comers lists. Now, these are perhaps one of the most common types of builds you see in 40k and one of the most flexible. A Take All Comers list isn't going to build heavily into one particular style or unit and will instead take a mix of units, profiles, and weapon options. It's going to have shooting, it's going to have combat, it's going to have some anti-horde capabilities, but also anti-heavy capabilities. It will often have access to psychic powers. And the end result is a list that's very capable of doing a range of different things and adapting to a range of different challenges. Good examples from earlier sort of builds would be the Leviathan Tyranids builds, which combined a really durable bricks of warriors with aggressive sort of range potential from harpies, very powerful psychic support in zone thropes, and the sort of aggressive melee punch of hive tyrants to achieve a whole range of different goals. Emperor's Children lists build into Noise Marines to mix shooting and combat, supported by Terminators for resilience, psychic characters, and dangerous characters in Abaddon or Demon Princes for melee punch as well. And finally, Chaos Demons, I think, are a very interesting example of the Take All Comers list. Between the shooting offered by Flamers, the punch of large-scale, powerful monsters, and the supporting utility of troops and beasts, Chaos Demons are very flexible and able to adapt to a range of different situations. So what's the strength of a Take All Comers list? Well, it is strategically flexible and it is balanced. It's able to deal with a whole range of different profiles that might confront it in a very diverse tournament meta, and it's able to adapt to different challenges and questions being asked of it. Ultimately, the weakness of Take All Comers lists is that when it plays into a very heavily skewed matchup, it might not have enough of the one particular tool or ingredient that is needed to solve it available to win the matchup. Sometimes as well, the supporting traits, sort of faction traits or supporting traits and stratagems are a bit diluted if you have lots of different types of units in your list, because there's less sort of emphasis or less exaggeration of the particular types that your trait might support. If you have a combat army, for example, your trait gives you +1 attack and you take ranged units in your list, it's not going to benefit as much. So some of the best Take All Comers lists out there, I think, really build into traits which enable them to benefit in multiple different phases. Again, Emperor's Children are a great example of this. Ignoring modifiers and getting extra AP on attacks across the board in different situations is extremely flexible and powerful. Take All Comers lists are really common. They're a really fun and enjoyable way to play the game, and I think it's the kinds of lists that people typically build when they're first starting out, and they're an enduring build in the meta. Right, let's think about gun lines. Gun lines are ever present in 40k. It is a gun game after all. Gun lines emphasize range damage and often play a more defensive early game with a strategy that involves dominating in the late game. Simply put, you stand back, shoot the opponent off the board, and then you move to take over the objectives and score your points. Some good examples of this include Imperial Guard lists with heavy emphasis on tanks, artillery, and foot infantry. Votan lists with a heavy emphasis on sort of the shooting of bikes and land fortresses, and balanced and flexible Imperial Knights and Tau lists that aren't heavily skewed in any particular direction also tend to do this as well. Now, the strength of a gun line is its range dominance. If you have more guns and better guns, chances are you're going to win the shooting matchup, which can put you in a really strong position in a game of 40k to simply blast the opponent off the board and then take advantage of their sort of vulnerability to your shooting. It is not without risk, though, as gun lines have weaknesses. They can get pinned, they can get tied up. At times, their secondary scoring is a little inflexible or a little bit vulnerable to interference by the opponent. Staying back and playing a late game or defensive strategy does mean surrendering some control of the board and dominance on the board to the opponent. And so if you're not able to kill them quickly enough, you can find yourself playing catch up and struggling to make up a points deficit. Generally, though, gun lines are a very popular choice in 40k, especially at events with lighter terrain, and you will expect to encounter and face gun lines across your 40k career. Alpha strikes. They're back, baby. They're back in vogue right now. Alpha strikes are a sort of build that place a real emphasis on being very aggressive early in the game. The goal here being to cripple your opponent, put a huge hole in their army, make it very difficult for them to recover, and set yourself up to be in an advantageous position for subsequent turns. Armies that do this well are ones that can pack a real massive turn one punch. So Iron Hands with their use of drop pods to deliver devastator shooting, and Raven Wing with lots of options for pre-game moving and hitting you really hard with bikes and land speeders are both current builds that are looking to exploit this. Tau have been playing an Alpha Strike build for some time, especially when Sunsharp Bombers were dominant. But with changes in Arcs of Omen, they're now perhaps not quite the Alpha Strike force that they were. The advantages to Alpha Striking are fairly straightforward. You can take control of the game early. You are dominating the opponent, you're putting a massive dent in their resources, and you're often putting them under very real pressure to stay alive, which can make it difficult for them to score their points and stay in the game. The vulnerability and weakness of Alpha Strikes stem from the risk of overexposure, right? Alpha Striking involves taking a big swing at the opponent very fast, and that in turn is exposing your army to retaliation. If you don't do as much damage as you were hoping, it's very possible that the opponent then picks you up in reply. Sometimes overexposure also means you've given the opponent opportunities in terms of charging, counter-attacking, and getting themselves back into a stronger position on the board. So it's definitely not without risk, but it's an extremely powerful build and one that you have to be ready to deal with. Next up, we have vehicle or monster skew. Skew of all kinds tends to lean into spamming lots of a particular profile. In this case, you're emphasizing large, hard to kill, or efficient profiles. So some recent examples would include Imperial Knight Armiger spam, taking lots of small Imperial Knights and buffing them up in terms of their resilience. You also saw Tyrannid Carnifex spam, in which the -1 damage and good armor saves of Carnifexes sort of cover the board, make it really hard for the opponent to remove them. And some classics from earlier on in the edition include the Orc Speedwar with lots of buggies and planes, and Drakari Thick City with its spam of Talos and Grotesques, really again leaning into a -1 damage defensive trait. Now, the advantage of skew is always very straightforward. If you present the opponent with tons and tons of a particular profile, chances are they don't have infinite weapons with which to deal with that profile. That means that if you're able to take out their anti-vehicle or anti-monster shooting, they are then left with a bunch of units that aren't able to deal with the sheer weight of attacks and threat posed by Armigers and Carnifexes in those examples. The weakness of skew is very simple. You're usually asking one question, and if the opponent has an answer of it, it can be very hard to come up with a plan B. If they have very good anti-vehicle shooting, if they have a secondary game plan where they can hide, play around you, or block you in, it can be very difficult to deal with. So although it's extremely powerful in its own right, I think skew lists tend to struggle as soon as they come up against something that's able to answer the question they're posing. Next up, we have MSU, or multiple small units. This is a very popular archetype that's not a world away from Take All Comers in several different ways. It places emphasis on lots of small infantry units, small, cheap, giving you lots and lots of assets and utility on the board. Examples of this include Drakari Good Stuff with lots and lots of different 5-man squads in vehicles all over the board, Harlequins with their emphasis on troops in transports, Blood Angels Jump Pack lists where you have again lots of small squads able to fly all over the place. And Sisters of Battle also do this with lots and lots of small squads coming in from reserves and lots of small trading pieces all across the board. Now, the advantage of MSU is that you have a lot of units to throw away to do jobs and score the mission. You can throw units away to score for primary or deny secondary, or primary scoring for your opponent. And then you can also trade your assets away. You can take out opponents' units and still have plenty left in reserves. You can also overload the board, send out lots and lots of units at once, which can be hard for the opponent to deal with and respond to. The biggest appeal, I think, of MSU lists is the utility in terms of scoring. You always have assets left to go and do tasks in the game and keep your score up. The overall weakness of MSU builds is that they tend to be relatively fragile and vulnerable to lists that are very much built into resilience or output. So skew of different kinds or gun lines can often pick up MSU armies before they can get going and before they can achieve the score that they are seeking. Fragility, definitely their biggest risk, but MSU works very well on good terrain and is a very common archetype in the 40k world. Next up, we've got Horde. I think Horde is a little bit out of style in the world of 40k. There aren't that many true Horde lists left, although there is one in the Genestealer cults, which I've been playing lately. Horde places an emphasis on large infantry units. Genestealer cults are a great example. Huge carpets of neophytes, acolytes, genestealers, bikers covering the board, taking up space. Traditional green-tied orc builds that had lots and lots of orc boys and bodies on the ground also did this. Rack spam Drakari, in which you just took hundreds of racks, did this. And Terminus S Death Guard, with its emphasis on zombies and poxwalkers and plague marines, also did this too. Now, the advantage of a horde is similar to vehicle or monster skew. It takes lots of a particular profile and asks the opponent if they really have enough guns to deal with it. A lot of the time the answer is no, because again, well-rounded lists, take-all-comers lists, will often be kitted out to deal with a whole range of profiles. So all that anti-tank shooting is going to waste firing into a horde. The weakness here is the same. If the opponent can answer the question, finding a plan B can be difficult. If they do have enough anti-horde shooting, do have enough shots, or they themselves are putting you under enough pressure that your horde is struggling to score and do what it wants to do, it can be very difficult to recover the situation. So it's another kind of skew build, but one that you do still see out there in the 40k world. Next up, and finally for today, we have pressure lists. These are an increasingly popular way to play the game at the moment. They put a real emphasis on dominating the board, by which I mean expanding all over it, taking up as much space as possible, and pinning the opponent back. They're often very dominant in the fight phase and ready to push the opponent off of any objectives and simply not let them get a foothold in the game. Examples of lists that do this are Creations of Bile with their melee dominance, Truck and Kill Rig Orcs with the use of truck boys to throw enemy units into the opponent's face turn one and take up space and just dominate the primary, and Kraken Tyranids, which are able to use their speed and reach to hit the enemy all across the board and keep them under pressure. Now, the strength of doing this is not dissimilar to an Alpha Strike build, and it has some of the same weaknesses too. Pressure lists dominate the primary. They take up space. They get in the opponent's face, which can make it really difficult for the opponent to get their own plan for scoring points off the board. And these imposing lists occupy space for long enough to simply deny scoring to the opponent. The weaknesses are the same. If you're going to be applying pressure, then you are going to be exposed. And sometimes pressure lists simply expose too much to the enemy too early and can end up getting destroyed and blown back off the board. They're also quite vulnerable to alpha strikes, because if an opponent gets their pressure plan into action early, destroys your key threats and makes it impossible for you to get out, it can mean that your own game plan of dominating the primary simply backfires. And so there is a vulnerability to pressure lists. They really like to go first. They really like to take up space, and they are vulnerable to lists that are going to do the same thing back to them. Thank you very much for listening to this very first episode of The List Doctor. I am going to be doing sort of more archetype-based episodes in the future, but I'm also going to run a couple of episodes where I examine lists that different people have sent to me and look at ways to adapt and improve them to make them better at what they do. The goal here is very much to help you work with the concept and theme you're already working with. It's not necessarily going to be the most competitive or the most optimal outcomes, but it will be thinking about how you can improve on and develop the particular theme or angle you're looking to work. If you would like to be involved in that, you can send a list to me at lowestofmen@gmail.com or to the 6++ Discord or socials for feedback. Please do check out more of our content, and I'll hope to see you again soon.